Hi everybody, this is a review video for Unit 6 for APUSH. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen with you. What I'm going to do is just go over a couple of the PowerPoints that we've done, chapters 20, 21, and 22. That'll go over pretty much the whole time period. So I'm going to go over it quickly just so we get the main ideas for each of the different chapters. So this is chapter 20. This is about imperialism. So we kind of start off with some examples of the United States going beyond the contiguous United States. For example, buying Alaska in the 1860s, going for Hawaii in the 1880s and 1890s. Okay, we do a lot of these for economic reasons. We find a lot of natural gas and oil in Alaska. Hawaii is going to be good for fruit plantations, and economically, it's going to be good for using as a base to trade with other countries. So we begin to expand beyond our borders, and this is all seen as a positive thing by many powerful Americans. The idea of American exceptionalism, that America has a unique destiny to bring about democracy and civilization around the world. And Alfred T. Mann here believes that if we're going to be powerful, we need to have a strong navy so we can grow. And that's another reason why taking over Hawaii is a really positive thing for the United States, according to Mann. So basically, we don't need to know too much about Hawaii's, how it takes over. Basically, just a quick reminder, Hawaii had a queen, Queen Liliuokalani there, but the United States had plantation owners that wanted to make Hawaii a territory of the United States, and so helped to overthrow her leadership, and eventually Congress would annex Hawaii in 1898. Now, leading up to the Spanish-American War, these are some causes of the war. Remember, Cuba is a territory of Spain. They tried to have their own revolution. However, they lost, and many Spanish rebels were put into concentration camps. Here you can see people starving, pile of dead bodies, and all this made Americans feel bad for the Cubans and dislike the Spanish. Yellow journalists are media newspapermen who try to highlight the bad things that's going on around the world to sell newspapers. And this is going to lead to a surge of nationalism. It's going to make more Americans dislike the Spanish. The Delome letter is another cause of the war. Basically, Delome was the Spanish minister to the United States, and he talked about how McKinley was bad. He was talking trash about him, and Delome would resign. So this is, again, going to make Americans upset at Spain. But the event that is the spark is literally a spark with USS Maine exploding in Havana Harbor. There's this idea that it was a Spanish mine that did it. However, later on, it's determined that it was actually a boiler inside the boat. However, McKinley asked for a declaration of war after yellow journalism and the public are blaming Spain. For the national exam, you're not going to need to know anything about the war itself. Really, the only thing you might need to know is Theodore Roosevelt fought with the Rough Riders, and that's how he became famous. Okay, I don't need to know this. Ending the war was the Treaty of Paris. And so what we need to know from this, the Treaty of Paris, is that the United States is going to get, you can see it right here, Puerto Rico and Guam. It's also going to get the Philippines. But because the Philippines is worth so much, the United States is also going to pay Spain $20 million down here. So we get Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, and Spain gets $20 million. So America's growing. Holding the Philippines becomes very difficult. The fighting over the Philippines is going to last a long time. In 3 years of warfare, 4,000 Americans are going to die because the Filipinos want their independence, and we don't want that to happen. We also say that in these insular cases, that when we take over other territories, it does not necessarily mean that the people that we take over are U.S. citizens. Congress can decide who and where people are going to be citizens. Now, taking over the Philippines is also great economically for the United States because it's right next to China. And now with us being so close to China, we can go and try to access China. However, all these countries want a little piece of China and decide to make an agreement amongst each other called the open door. The open door policy was that any country can come in and trade with China and no one is going to try to take over it all. All these countries are pretty supportive of this. Who is not supportive of it is the Boxers. Boxers are just a Chinese nationalist group who basically tries to destroy anything that's not Chinese. I'm going to skip this. The United States is going to also try to grow economically around the world through its development of a canal through Panama. Eventually, when Roosevelt becomes president, they're going to spend a lot of money and a lot of manpower on building this canal through Panama. Eventually, they do it. The Panama Canal is going to make it a lot faster and more efficient for American ships to travel from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. Okay. Platt Amendment makes Cuba a protectorate of the United States, so we can intervene there if we see fit, but they're pretty much independent. And the Roosevelt Corollary is saying that we're going to have our ability to regulate what's going on in the Americas. It's not Europe's responsibility. So it's kind of taking the Monroe Doctrine and injecting it with steroids, right? It's not that we're protecting Latin America from Europe. It's we're in charge of the Americas. And that's from Roosevelt. I'm just going to skip Wilson, New Mexico. Don't need it. Skip it. So reasons why the United States is entering World War I. You probably won't need to know the reasons why Europe goes to war, but just a reminder, it's the main reasons: militarism, alliances, imperialism, nationalism, and the spark is the assassination. For the United States, it takes a lot longer. Did they want to get involved in the war or not? Roosevelt or Wilson wants to be neutral. You can see it up here, neutral in fact as well as in name, impartial in thought as well as in action. So he really wants America to be neutral. In fact, when he's running for president, he goes by the tagline, "He kept us out of war." Progressives like Senator La Follette don't want to go to war because fighting in a war is going to be really expensive, and then you can spend less money on progressive ideas. However, the two big things that are going to lead to America getting involved are unrestricted submarine warfare. An example of that, an early example of that, is Lusitania, and later on the Zimmerman Note. Okay, only after this and only after continued unrestricted submarine warfare does Wilson ask for a declaration of war. Again, we don't really need to know anything about the fighting itself. They've never, and they probably will never, ask about the actual fighting itself, so we're going to skip a lot of this. But how does America back at home change? The War Industries Board is going to basically figure out, okay, how do our industries take the scarce amount of resources and convert factories into war production, set prices, and how do they get the resources to the industries that need them? They're also going to create the Committee on Public Information. This is going to be basically a propaganda arm of the government to try to convince Americans that their side is right and the other side is bad, evil. With that, they tried to stamp out any dissent, any arguments against joining the war. And so that we have things like the Espionage and Sedition Acts of the war. Basically, if you try to go against the United States, promote the cause of its enemies, you talk against the war, you could go to jail. And one man, Schenck, he's going to sue the government for this. But the government said, if you pose a clear and present danger to the safety of the country during a time of war, they can take away some of your civil liberties. Let's see, African Americans and Mexican Americans are going to be a part of the war effort. Many African Americans joined the war. Many Mexican Americans will work as farm labor and for industrial jobs. And many women will also take wartime employment opportunities. Through this war, women also are seen as necessary not only for economic changes, but also for political changes. For a long time, women have been fighting for the right to vote. We can see a couple of groups here, like the National American Women's Suffrage Association, the National Women's Party, been fighting for suffrage for many, many years. Because women were so involved with the war and were necessary to help win the war. By 1918, Wilson reversed his position on suffrage and supported women voting as a war measure. And so right after the war ended, Congress gave women the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. Treaty of Versailles, I'm going to go through it very quickly. The big thing that's going to hurt America's involvement is going to be Article 10, right down here. It looks like Article X, because if one country goes and fights, everybody has to go and fight. That's going to create a problem for the United States. These are all world history stuff. It's going to create a problem for the United States because many Americans are afraid that we are losing our ability to fight when we want to. We're losing our war powers. And so the fight between Henry Cabot Lodge and Wilson is going to be whether or not to join the League of Nations or the Treaty of Versailles. Eventually, the United States does not join the Treaty of Versailles. So we don't join the treaty, we don't join the League of Nations. Basically, we've set up a world where it's going to be ripe for another world war. And that's it for chapter 20. And as I'm going through this pretty fast. So, make sure you pause and you rewind, or you go through things again, you read it on your own, and then listen to me say it. And remember, if you ever have any questions, you can always email your teacher for help too. Okay, chapter 21. So from war to depression. Here's our central question. So we talked about before World War I, back in Unit 5, about progressivism. And just this unit, we talked about increasing imperialism. But now America wants more isolationism. And many American businessmen want to stop the progressive changes and want to add businesses as a top priority. And so labor union membership did increase during World War I, but business leaders are going to use this as a method to spread fear about labor unions, that they could want a revolution in the United States. And so this leads to a Red Scare in the United States, basically a fear of communist influences, even though the Communist Party was very small at this time. The Red Scare was not just about labor unions, though. Labor union or um, the Red Scare was also about people who they determined were radicalists, people who wanted to go against the government, like with the Palmer raids, where a bunch of people in the government were sent bombs through the mail, and so Palmer, who was the Attorney General, there he is, raided radical organizations and deported thousands of legal immigrants, even though they didn't break any laws. The Red Scare leads this anti-radicalism and anti-immigration movement in the United States. One of the cases is Sacco and Vanzetti, who were arrested for murder. They were Italian immigrants. They were also anarchists. And in the court case, the prosecutor talked about how they were tied to radical groups and that they were anarchists. That has nothing to do with whether they murdered somebody or not. And this became a huge case, not only in the U.S. but around the world, of what the United States was doing to immigrants. During World War I, we talked about how thousands of African Americans moved to northern cities to work in wartime jobs. After the war, when many African Americans who had fought came back, it led to a lot of racial conflict, as many are coming back to cities where white and black people are competing for jobs and for housing. And so we see a lot of racially based riots right after the war, like in Chicago, the Tulsa, Oklahoma riots. Basically, throughout this time, the United States is not doing much to stop racial violence in the United States. I'm going to skip this. I'm going to skip this. Harding, he's president in the 1920s. Really, all we need to know about him is that he wants conservative politics where the government does not get involved with businesses. We also might want to know about Harding that his administration had a lot of scandal, like the Teapot Dome scandal, where government officials were leasing government land with oil to businesses. However, Harding died, and Calvin Coolidge became president before any of this was released to the public. Coolidge also wants businesses to have a lot of power, and in 1924, he defeats the Democrats and progressives. The Progressive Party basically falls apart at this point. So America is kind of full on with conservative politics and spending a lot of money on, or spending a lot of political capital on giving businesses more power. Businesses are growing. They're providing consumer goods like toasters and radios and telephones and vacuum cleaners and automobiles. And through all this, while businesses are making a bunch of stuff, people are buying it, there's actually a lot of problems in American industry. Coal, textiles, railroads industries are facing drops in costs and prices. Rural and lower income Americans did not do very well in the decade. Here you can see some prices of farm products. We're going to skip movies. We're going to skip flappers. More people are buying cars. Skip that. I'm going to skip this. Remember, Prohibition in the 1920s is going on, where America is prohibiting all manufacture and sale of alcohol. So this leads to a lot of people breaking the law by going to speakeasies, and gangsters like Al Capone competing with each other over territory, leading to increased violence. Basically, it would be repealed in 1933 and very unpopular. You can see a bunch of pictures there. Some of the more culture wars in the 1920s was between big city and rural areas. One example of this is the Scopes trial. Scopes trial was the teacher who wanted to teach Darwin's theory of evolution, but that broke the law in Tennessee. And so Americans had to decide for themselves if they would side with Christian fundamentalism, the idea that the Bible is inspired word of God, or to believe in new scientific research. We talked about this anti-immigration movement in the 1920s. This idea that new immigrants are bringing anarchy, socialism, and radicalism. And so Congress will pass the National Origins Act in 1924, making it more difficult for new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, to come into the United States. The KKK also resurged in the 1920s to its highest point. They expanded their hate beyond African Americans to also include immigrants, Catholics, and Jews. And in 1928, as conservative politics is growing businesses in the 1920s, and it seems like our economy is going up and up and up, Republicans see the victory of Herbert Hoover in 1928. A big change for African Americans in the 1920s was the Harlem Renaissance. It was this new idea called the New Negro, where African Americans were questioning society and African American roles in society, but also that African Americans should be proud of who they are and their involvement in the creation of the United States. And part of this was through painting, through writing, and through music, like jazz music that became the music of the decade that swept across the country. Okay. This is Marcus Garvey, who mobilized African American workers and fought for Black nationalism. He talked about things like moving back to Africa, and said that people of African descent should work together to create a community all their own. In 1929, the stock market will crash. Unemployment reaches 24%. People stop spending money because they don't have any money. Americans aren't able to pay back their loans. Banks go out of business. Okay, and we'll see in chapter 22, chapter 22, what happens with the Great Depression. Okay. Oops. So Great Depression. So remember Hoover, he believes in conservative politics. So he believes in volunteerism, that business and community should regulate itself. The United States should not get involved. Excuse me. And rugged individualism, that individual peoples have the responsibility to get themselves out of this economic problem. So Hoover believes in cutting taxes, that the government should not do that much to help the people, because of rugged individualism, the people should be able to help themselves. So we're going to skip this. We're just going to get that. So Hoover doesn't do too much. Because of that, many people start to blame Hoover for the problems. They called these shanty towns Hoovervilles. A newspaper was a Hoover blanket. Anything that had to do with basically losing money and being poor, they named after Hoover. The final nail in the coffin for Hoover was the Bonus Army, where thousands of World War I veterans came to the United States Capitol to demand their bonus, their retirement money. However, Congress said no, and then the Army, led by sent out by Hoover, went out and basically forced the veterans to leave, which made people's dislike of Hoover grow. So in 1932, Hoover lost in the landslide election to Franklin D. Roosevelt. So Roosevelt is coming into the White House in 1933, and he's going to bring in the New Deal. So to try to tell people about what his policy is, he's going to use the radio to do fireside chats where he tries to tell people his policy. And in the first 100 days, he's going to get a lot of bills passed to try to make a lot of changes. So he does things like a bank holiday, where banks close, so he can talk to the people about what's going on with banks and why they should not take out their money in bank runs. They also create the Glass-Steagall Act, which makes the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC, saying that your money in a bank is insured by the government up to $2,500. So basically, this is going to make people say, oh, I don't need to take my money in a bank anymore because it's all protected by the government. The AAA is going to pay farmers to grow less food. So this is going to raise crop prices. We're going to skip the NRA. Really, the one I want you to know here is the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, putting thousands of young men to work, doing conservation work, doing trails and parks and bridges and roads and all these different things in state and local parks. We're going to skip these two. We're going to skip this. Basically, people thought that the New Deal was bad because it was socialism. Some people thought that the New Deal didn't go far enough. Townsend thought there should be a monthly retirement fund, pension plan for anyone who is elderly. Huey Long wanted the Share Our Wealth Society, where basically you can't make more than like $1 million or something like that, and the government would take any money that you make over that much money and give it to everybody else. The second New Deal is in 1935. We're going to go to the Social Security Act, which is going to give people the pensions that they can have after they retire. So after you work for 30 or so years, you can retire, and the government will continue to give you money when you're older. You can also get money for if you're a widowed mother, if you are unemployed, if you're disabled. Let's skip that. Roosevelt wins in a landslide again in 1936. Now, many of the Supreme Court members did not approve the New Deal programs. They shut down the NRA, they shut down the AAA, and so Roosevelt threatened to pack the court by nominating more judges, 6 more judges to the Supreme Court who would favor the New Deal. But the Supreme Court kind of changed after this time period and began to support the New Deal. And it also made many Americans dislike Roosevelt because it seemed like he was trying to take over the government. Okay, we're going to skip that. Fair Labor Standards Act creates a minimum wage. The New Deal, unfortunately, did not do a lot for African Americans. While it did provide some jobs, there were no civil rights legislations passed during the decade, and also there was a lot of problems with FHA was a housing authority which created public housing for Americans. FHA was extremely racist in how it segregated Americans. Even when there was a city where there wasn't segregation before this, the FHA required that new apartment buildings that were getting money from them would be segregated. Okay, skipping. The Dust Bowl created economic problems in the Great Plains at the same time as the Great Depression. So many Americans had to move to places like California. TVA is another program, gave people jobs, but it also gave people electricity. Okay, the WPA painted, and there you go. That's it for Great Depression. That's it for Unit 6. So I went through that a lot, pretty fast. So hopefully that is helpful for you, but hopefully you can pause and rewind, read things in your own time. Remember that you have a multiple choice quiz that takes some time this week. So if you have any questions, please just email your teacher.